Islamism and the world's response to it has arguably been at the top of the international agenda since not long after the end of the Cold War. For our long-form interview this week, I've been talking to a woman who has strong views on Islamism, feminism and power. Maryam Namazie was born in Iran and is a co-founder of the British Council of Ex-Muslims and the feminist protest movement Fitna. I asked her to sum up her worldview.
I guess my worldview is one in which the human being is at the center of things rather than religions or dogma or anything. I think for me, nothing should be sacred except possibly the human being. And so I think a lot of the work that I do is towards defending rights and equality and criticizing and challenging dogmas in whatever form that they might be.
But I suppose you're best known as the co-founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims, and a lot of the publicity you get is about your views on Islam. How would you sum those up?
I think Islam, like any religion, is something that was written for very many years ago. It's not very relevant to the 21st century. You can find misogyny and homophobia and a lot of inhumanity in all religions, not just Islam. I think with Islam, though, the problem is that because it's got a political movement attached to it, it's got state power that uses Islam as its banner. You've got actually Islamic theocracies in this day and age. As a result, a lot of the rules and regulations that are within religious texts are now being implemented as law. And so you find that even though we're living in the 21st century, there are people still being stoned to death for adultery or being executed for being gay or for being apostates. And so I suppose given the fact that it is linked to this political movement, I think it's quite important to challenge religion and particularly Islam.
Well, so is your criticism of religion, or particularly this religion, or is it about state power when it's linked to religion?
I think it's hard to separate the two because, in a sense, very often when you're dealing with the Islamist movement or, let's say, the Islamic regime in Iran or the Saudi regime, the criticism of the state is very often linked to criticism of religion. So they are analogous in many instances, and that's why if you criticize the state, you will also possibly be accused of enmity against God in a place like Iran or Saudi Arabia, or, blasphemy or insulting Islam and the Prophet, whereas you might be actually criticizing religious rules and regulations or the state. And so I think that it is they are quite intrinsically linked. And historically also we've seen that criticism of religion has been intrinsically linked with anti-clericalism. And I think it's actually the same today when you're looking at Islam.
But can you see why ordinary Muslims who are just going about their daily business, perhaps in a state that is not a theocracy, like Britain, feel under threat from those sort of views? When you say, well, what you're actually criticising is my way of life, my decision to dress like this, to do these things.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think no one should ever feel under threat. I mean, if anyone's under threat, it's also a lot of ex-Muslims and people who are speaking their mind, and they're facing threats from the Islamist movement. But I think that it's important to distinguish criticism of religion, which is an idea after all, and criticism of the far right, which is a political movement. So when you criticize the English Defence League or Britain First, it's not, automatically seen to be criticism or prejudice against Christians or the English. Obviously it's not, because you're dealing with a fascist movement. It's the same with Islamism. And I think one of the important things is to separate Muslims from Islam and Islamism, and I think the problem with this point of view that sees a criticism of Islam and Islamism as an attack on Muslims is that it can't see the vast amounts of protest and dissent that exists within those who are considered the Muslim community or the Muslim world. So there's huge fights for secularism, for women's liberation, for equality, not just in a place like Iran or Afghanistan or what have you, but also within Muslim communities here in Europe.
What's the evidence for that, though? Because, as you say, looking from outside, it does look pretty monolithic. It does look as if people believe the same things, think the same way, and aren't very tolerant of any dissent from within that. So the perception, at least, is that people criticise those who want to go a slightly separate way, absolutely, and they say that you cannot be part of this faith if you don't believe all of these things.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the, what Islamists want you to believe is that they actually represent all Muslims. And I think it also is very much the government line and the establishment line as well that, Islamists represent Muslims to a large extent, because you see via multiculturalism as a social policy, via multi-faithism, large numbers of individuals have been put together into a so-called homogenized community where, they seem to deserve nothing better than faith-based schools or faith-based courts or faith-based, services. And it's sort of way of homogenizing large numbers of people. But I think if you just look at it from a logical point of view, not everyone in Britain is Christian. And not every Christian thinks the same way. You can have a Christian who thinks that gay people should be killed, and you have, Christians who are pro-gay rights. And I think this is one of the problems with placing collective blame or seeing large numbers of people as homogenized communities and societies, and that's not the case. If you look at anything from the veil to the issue of Sharia law to gender segregation, these are highly contested issues within the Muslim community as well. I think one of the main problems is that what we're faced with is that because there's this conflation between Islam as an idea, Islamism, which is a far-right movement, with Muslims, it's hard to see the dissent because, the authentic Muslim is only a person who is reactionary and wants apostates to die and, wants to burn buildings when they see a cartoon of Muhammad. Obviously, that's not the case because there wouldn't be any place to move if every Muslim in this world felt that way, which is clear that they don't. And there are many Muslims who are siding with secularists, with liberation movements. You just have to look at the many examples that are available. Karima Ben-Noun, who's an Algerian-American law professor, she's written a book not very long ago called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here. And in it, she interviews 300 people who are Muslims or of Muslim heritage. Someone like myself too, for example, would fit into that description, who are challenging Islamism very often at great risk to their lives.
Well, that's true, and we'll get on to the risk to you, but you were talking there about the religious right and about the government and establishment here being in favour of multiculturalism and how much you don't like that. You've also talked about cultural relativism. Do you think that there are some cultures are better than others then?
No, again, I think culture, first of all, is not static. It's changing. Not everybody within a given society has the same culture. It's, as the writer Kenan Malik says, not everybody who is white European represents Enlightenment values, just as someone who is brown or black, who comes from the Middle East or North Africa, doesn't represent necessarily Sharia values. Their culture is something that is changed, it's adopted, it's questioned, it's constantly moving. And I think the problem is that with multiculturalism, not as a wonderful lived experience, I'm all for that, but as a social policy, what it does is it imposes, in a sense, the culture of those in power. And when you look at the so-called Muslim community, it's the Islamists that have the power. So
wait a minute, sorry, you said multiculturalism as a lived experience. Do you mean that you can walk along a street and have a falafel shop and a newsagent that's run by somebody from Turkey or Azerbaijan?
Yeah, exactly. Multiculturalism, where there are people from all over living together, and bringing wonderful things as well as, taking on wonderful things in the country that they've come to. But as a social policy, what it does is it sort of homogenizes communities, puts them in restrictive boxes, and fails to see that there are individuals in those boxes, there are gay Muslims in those boxes, ex-Muslims in those boxes. And I think that's the problem with it, because then it says this is their culture, this is their religion. And the state, rather than looking upon these people as citizens, looks upon them as a sort of community that needs to be managed and controlled by Islamist organizations, by regressive imams, norms. And, in a sense, what we're seeing is the further segregation of society rather than any sort of harmony and working together.
But but you mentioned multiculturalism and how much you hate it, and you've also talked about the religious right. But isn't multiculturalism an idea of the left? I know you come under fire from the left as well, but how does that square up with religion all being of the right?
Yeah, I think the thing is with multiculturalism, it's used by the left and by the right as well as by the establishment. The left uses it in order to justify Islamism and to say that this is people's religion, and if you criticize it, it's considered bigotry. The far right wing is also using it now as a way of pushing forward its own sort of white identity politics, and also placing collective blame on the other, equating all Muslims or all refugees and migrants with Islamists, which of course logically cannot be possible. And the government does that too by pushing forward faith-based schools, faith-based laws, courts, services, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a hugely problematic thing in the sense that we need, in my opinion, we need to just go back to the basics. What happened to citizens? What happened to equality, irrespective of your background, community, or beliefs?
But surely the left thinks that from the very good point. It starts from the very good point of saying, well, look, perhaps as a white male, I'm very privileged, and therefore it's not really up to me to judge someone who's not of that background. You can see where they're coming from, can't you? That identity is very important, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm someone on the left myself, and I think that it is very important to let people live and let live. But I think the problem with this perspective is that it only sees identity politics, and so it's no longer a question of showing solidarity with movements for women's liberation, for gay rights, and so on and so forth. It's all about identity, and the problem with that is that the identity that is seen to be the group identity is the identity. It's usually that of some Islamist organization, an imam, unelected, very often regressive representatives, often not elected in any way, not necessarily legitimate even representatives, and it becomes very dangerous in the sense that then there are one set of rights and values for the so-called white male and another for those who are deemed to be minorities. And, in a sense, it turns on its head everything that the left supposedly fights for, which is equality no matter what color you are, no matter what sex you are, no matter what your sexuality is. It actually turns all of that on its head. And what we're seeing now is that for this type of left, which, are, in my opinion, they side with our fascists against their own fascists. This type of left, they don't see people anymore. They just defend culture, religion, and by doing that, in effect, they're saying that they're defending Islamism. And, so I think that actually betrays left principles.
You've been taking this message out on lectures and so forth for quite a long time. You were co-founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims, and there's quite a lot of literature goes out from them, but actually probably the most publicity recently has been because of the no platforming you got from the University of Warwick Students' Union, which was then overturned, and so there's a blaze of publicity about that. What's your view on that, which seems to be a bit of a trend, particularly amongst students, where they say we don't want to give a platform to people who may make our students feel uncomfortable, maybe putting forward views which they don't agree with?
Yeah, the University of Warwick Student Union denied permission to the Warwick Atheist Society to have me come and speak there on apostasy, blasphemy and free expression in the age of ISIS, initially obviously, and they said it was because I was inflammatory and because I could possibly incite hatred against Muslim students. And I find that really appalling in the sense that, first of all, they have such a low view of Muslim students that they think that they cannot even stand to hear an ex-Muslim woman speak. And again, that's not the case. There were Muslims who came to my talk. I work with many, many Muslims who are pro-women's rights and equality. So I think, again, it's this view that the authentic Muslim is regressive. If it's not the case, then that doesn't count for some of these people. And I think it is a disturbing trend in universities in particular, if we're going to look at it, this fact that it's no longer progressive now to defend unconditional free expression, but it's progressive to defend censorship. And, this, particularly when it comes to Islam and Islamism, it's seen to be so dangerous, so antisocial that, in a sense, if you do it, you are showing bigotry and possibly inciting hatred against people. And again, as I've explained earlier, this is not the case. In fact, Muslims, or those who come from Muslim backgrounds like myself, need this sort of criticism more than anything else, because this is our way to challenge those in power that try to stifle us. It's something that's very needed, this discussion and debate. And it's only through this sort of discussion that we can change things for the better.
Yeah, but those who are in favour of that idea of creating safe spaces for young people isn't just about theology. It's not just about Islamism or Islam. Quite a lot is about feminism and gender issues. I mean, we had the example of Jermaine Greer being no platformed at Cardiff University for her views on transgender people. That maybe ties into your views on feminism. And how does that clue into what you think about Islam? I mean, how does feminism relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just go back and say something about safe spaces. I mean, I understand the concept of safe spaces. They've been very important in protecting people who face discrimination or women who've been raped and so on and so forth. But university cannot be a safe space. In fact, I don't know who said that, but someone was saying that, in fact, universities need to be unsafe spaces, because they have to be places where you are challenged, where you question things, and where you hear things that take you out of your comfort zone. So to create safe spaces in a place where discussion and debate needs to go on is the opposite of what universities need to be. With regards Islam and women's rights, I mean, I think all religions are anti-woman, and I think all religions fundamentally, they target women. If you look at many of the verses in the Quran, in the Bible, in the Torah, women are very often targeted. There's a great quote by Khalid Hosseini, the Afghan writer, in one of his books. He says, the finger of the Islamist or the sort of male look at women is like a compass, always pointing north, and it's always pointing at a woman, blaming women for every calamity under the face of the sun.
And you're a spokesperson for fitna, aren't you? And is that word itself not kind of negative?
Well, yeah, I mean, fitna is a negative term in the sense that they say that if you're not veiled, if you're not covered up, if you speak too much, if you laugh too loud, you are the cause of chaos in society as women. And, so we are turning these concepts on their head and saying that, yes, we are a source of chaos, and we're here to shake things up for Islamism and for religion. And again, it's the same sort of use of the word ex-Muslim as well. It's sort of turning things on its head to say that we're not allowed to leave. Well, then we're going to challenge this very concept and come out publicly and call ourselves ex-Muslims.
What about the other thing which you are known for, which is your politics in terms of left or right? You're in the Worker Communist Party of Iran. I suspect that's quite a small party, but what is that, revolutionary or left? I suspect it's not social democrat. I mean, where are your politics in that left-right spectrum?
Yeah, well, in that left-right spectrum, it's basically the Worker Communist Party of Iran is a banned organisation in Iran. Obviously, in Iran, there is really no freedom of organisation or for political parties to be able to contest and speak publicly. So it's banned. A lot of its members are in exile. And of course, there are members in Iran, but who are active clandestinely. And the idea behind it is, of course, an idea that I think any socialist can quite understand, is that we need a different type of world, one that is not based on profit, but based on need and addressing need. And I think there is so much resources and wealth in this world, really, but the reality is that a vast majority are poor, they're hungry. If you just look at the refugee issue right now, the fact that people are not getting the sort of help and support that they need because of a system that's really benefits very few people.
But to get back to the idea of a worker communist party, is that not in and of itself, and because of its Marxist background, is that not really quite a disciplined idea where you must toe the party line and there isn't much room for free thinking?
Well, yeah, well, I would say that there is a history of that sort of position. Let's say when you look at the Soviet Union, China, very often very totalitarian sort of regimes and states, and not at all representing the liberation of people. From our perspective, it's all about people's liberation, not about dogma. So I think if any sort of party or movement that calls themselves worker communist or communist and socialist and denies people the right to speak, the right to think, and to even believe in things that I personally, for example, as an atheist, wouldn't agree with, I would find that very dodgy and not something I would be subscribed to. I myself personally am a worker communist because I think that people should be at the center of everything, that people should be sacred. And I think that is the fundamentals of a sort of idea that doesn't put profit first, puts people first. And I think for real liberation and real equality, it's not just a legal issue, it's not just a political issue, it also needs to be on a political and a social level as well.
I see that you were named a few years ago in a report on victims of intimidation, freedom of speech in Europe's Muslim communities, about public figures with an Islamic background that have been the focus of attention from extremist elements. Do you feel under threat, physical threat?
I think myself, like many other people, including many Muslims who dissent, you do face your share of death threats, some very funny and some not so funny. But I think, that's just part of the landscape today, isn't it? If you criticize Islam and Islamism, it can be a very scary thing, it can be a very frightening thing, and you do face threats from those who cannot tolerate any form of dissent. But having said that, I live in a country where there is a relative amount of freedom and where I am able to speak without the state wanting to execute me. And so in that sense, I think I have an added responsibility to continue speaking about issues, particularly when there's so many people who are raising these issues under much greater risk in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia. Someone like Raif Badawi, who's 10 years in prison now, facing 1,000 lashes merely for raising the concept of this need to talk about politics and religion. And there are countless examples of these sort of wonderful, brave people. And in a sense, I think for those of us who live in Europe, in Britain, we have an added responsibility to speak.
Can I ask how you got to this position? Because I've seen in talks you've given before about how you were born into, I suppose, a background of Islam, and so how did you get from there to here? What's your personal journey?
Yeah, I was born into a Muslim family. I was born in Iran, and my last name actually means prayer, which is very funny. So there are people who say you should call yourself ex-Namazie as well, just because don't sully the name of prayer with your name. And I quite like my name, so I'm not changing it. But my grandfather, for example, was an Islamic scholar. So sometimes my father will say he's turning in his grave every time I speak. But nonetheless, even though my father is very religious in the sense that he's never drunk, he's never had pork, he grew up praying 5 times a day and all of that stuff. He treated me very well as a girl. I never felt I was not equal because I was born a girl. He believed in our education, and he's very supportive, even though he doesn't agree with me. And this is the sort of thing that I always say is don't homogenize Muslims, because there are very many good Muslims out there, and many of them fighting Islamists. And I think actually a vast majority who don't agree with what's happening. And I think the more of us speak out, the more comfortable people will feel to also speak out.
Is there evidence that any are, not perhaps speaking out, but perhaps deciding to leave Islam? Because it's not an easy journey to make. I don't know what yours was like, but many people say that they feel cut off from friends and family.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a very personal issue. So there will be people who will have no problems with their families, like myself, and others who will be disowned and lose everyone and every person and every, from family to friends that they hold dear. And it can be a very, very difficult journey, particularly given the pressures that are involved. But I think, the reality is that for me personally, I left Islam when I came face to face with religion and political power after living in an Islamic regime in Iran. And I think for a lot of people, this is one reason why, a big reason why people leave, whether it's ISIS, whether it was September 11th. Of course, there are other personal reasons why people leave as well. But I do think there's a lot of people actually leaving, and we're getting to see just the tip of the iceberg thanks to social media and the internet, which is giving a level of safety and anonymity to a lot of people. I believe that there's a tsunami of atheism in the Middle East and North Africa and amongst Muslim communities, so-called Muslim communities in the West. And I think we are only seeing just a bit of it, and it's going to surprise the world, really.
Why do you think no politician then is approaching that? Why do no politicians say, let's target those who want to leave?
Well, I mean, again, I want to say that people obviously have a right to believe in their religion. They have a right to leave. And what we're fighting for is for people to be able to do whatever they want without pressure from the state or without pressure from the Islamists. I think part of the reason why the sort of things that I work on is very often invisible in mainstream media. It's something that, the reason I am, if anyone knows me, it's because of sort of grassroots organizing work. It's not because we've been given platforms in general by the media or by government, which has been busy, frankly, funding mainly Islamist groups and so-called moderates that we later find out are actually extremists. I think part of it is, of course, fear, and this fear of not being able to challenge. But a large part of it also has to do with the fact that for so long, Muslims are seen to be a homogenized group. So everyone thinks the same. There's no dissent. Everyone is like an Islamist to some degree. And that's why I think it's very hard for people to see dissent when they are told that none exists. But I think slowly this is changing, again, also thanks in large part to social media and to the work that groups like ours have done.
We're running out of time, but I just wanted to ask you finally, and we've talked about the risks you run in the work that you do, and you've been doing it for some time. What does the future hold? What do the next few years hold for you? What do you hope to achieve?
Well, I mean, I'm very optimistic, and I think you do have to be optimistic if you're going to be able to wake up every morning, given the atrocities that take place every day in Britain as well as everywhere else. And in a sense, for me, I think we can challenge Islamism, we can challenge inequality, we can fight for a different world. People have done many great things before us, which is why we live in, at least in Britain, we have certain rights that don't belong to others in other places, and a lot of this has come from challenging and questioning and pushing open the space that is very limited often. And so I think we are going to see changes, and I'm hopeful that we will. And I think what we do here in Britain against Sharia courts or gender segregation or for equality is very much linked to the fight of people in, let's say, Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan. We have many allies across the world, and we are a much bigger movement than we can even fathom, I think.
Maryam Namazie, thanks very much.
Thank you.